Night was cold over London in 1940, and the air smelled of smoke and fear. Searchlights cut across the dark sky as the wail of air raid sirens echoed through the city. Inside an underground hospital built beneath the ruins of what had once been a grammar school, a young nurse named Evelyn Clark tied her apron tighter and ran toward the sound of stretchers scraping against concrete. Her hands shook, but not from fear. She had long since learned to silence that. Fear was a luxury. Duty was not. She had been a nurse for less than a year when the Blitz began, and every night since then had taught her that courage didn't come from strength. It came from necessity. Tonight was no different. The wounded poured in. Soldiers, civilians, firemen. Faces burned, limbs gone, lungs filled with dust. Evelyn's voice was steady, her movements quick, her eyes fixed on the next life she could still save. Somewhere above, the bombs fell like thunder, and the ground trembled. But down here, under the rubble, life fought back. Thousands of miles away, in a small wooden building hidden deep in the English countryside, another kind of battle was being fought. One without blood, without sound. Joan Harper adjusted her glasses and stared at the rows of numbers streaming out of the machine in front of her. She was 24, a mathematics graduate from Cambridge, and one of the hundreds of women who had been quietly recruited to work at a place known only as Bletchley Park. Her job was to find meaning in madness, to break the codes that carried the secrets of the German war machine. Around her, the air hummed with typewriters, cigarette smoke, and concentration so thick it seemed to vibrate. Each string of numbers she cracked meant ships would reach their convoys safely. Bombers would avoid ambush. Lives would be saved. But she couldn't tell anyone, not her family, not even her closest friends. Her work was top secret, hidden under layers of silence. At night, she would walk back to her dormitory under a moonlit sky, listening to the faint hum of wireless transmissions in the distance, wondering how many people lived or died that day because of something she'd deciphered. Back in America, in the booming heart of Detroit, the factory floor roared with noise. Women in overalls, hair tied up in scarves, stood shoulder to shoulder assembling engines, welding fuselages, riveting metal under clouds of smoke and sparks. Rosie Turner, once a waitress from Ohio, now worked 10-hour shifts building B-24 bombers. Her hands were calloused, her back ached, and her ears rang from the pounding of machinery. But every time she looked at the half-built aircraft rising before her, she felt something powerful: pride. The men had gone to fight. The women had stepped in to keep the world turning. They called her and her friends Rosies, after a propaganda poster that promised they could do it. But the reality was harder. The heat of the factory, the rationing, the sleepless nights, the worry for husbands and brothers overseas, it wore them down. Yet every day they came back. Every bolt tightened was a blow struck for victory. And in occupied France, another woman fought a quieter, deadlier war. Claire Duval, a former university student fluent in English and German, had joined the resistance after her brother was executed by the Gestapo. To the world, she was a café waitress in Lyon. To the Allied Intelligence Network, she was Colette, a courier for the Special Operations Executive. Her mission was simple in words, but perilous in practice. Deliver coded messages, smuggle weapons, guide downed airmen to safety. She carried her secrets in the hem of her skirt, in invisible ink on scraps of paper, in songs sung softly to signal safe houses. One mistake meant torture or death. Yet she smiled every morning as she poured coffee for German officers, listening, memorizing, passing their words to the right ears. Her courage was invisible, her victories silent. The war consumed every corner of the world, and these women, Evelyn, Joan, Rosie, Claire, fought in ways history rarely mentioned. Evelyn kept stitching torn flesh and shattered hope beneath the bombs. Joan kept turning chaos into patterns that saved fleets. Rosie kept the engines of freedom alive with her bare hands. Claire kept defying an empire with her quiet defiance. They never met, but their stories ran parallel, connected by unseen threads of endurance and faith. In London, the air raids worsened. One night, as Evelyn prepared another stretcher, the hospital ceiling shook violently, dust raining from above. The power went out. In the dim light of a single lantern, she continued operating on a soldier whose pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. Her superior's voice broke through the chaos. "Clark, clamp it now!" Her fingers obeyed automatically. When dawn came, the hospital was still standing, though half the street above it was gone. Evelyn stepped outside to see the sunrise painting the smoke-stained sky pink. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry. Not from grief, but from sheer exhaustion. She looked around at her fellow nurses, their faces streaked with soot, and realized none of them had slept more than 2 hours in days. Yet, when the next siren wailed, they went back underground without hesitation. At Bletchley Park, Joan sat in front of her Enigma decrypts, her brain numb from numbers. A message had come in: Japanese naval transmissions, complex and relentless. The war in Europe was raging, but in the Pacific, something darker was unfolding. Her section chief, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Stevens, handed her a slip of paper. "We need this by morning," he said simply. That meant no sleep again. She worked through the night, tracing repeated groups, aligning ciphers, testing patterns against intercepted weather codes. When she finally cracked the last sequence, she realized the message referred to an enemy convoy heading toward the Solomon Islands. Somewhere far away, an American submarine would ambush it thanks to her work. She felt a flicker of pride, and then guilt. Victory always meant someone else's death. She folded the paper and passed it along, her face expressionless. Rosie Turner wiped the sweat from her forehead as she lifted another engine part into place. Around her, the factory buzzed like a living organism. Women laughing, shouting over the noise, trading ration coupons during breaks. But beneath the surface, everyone carried the same ache. Letters came less frequently now. The war dragged on. Some women received telegrams with black borders. Rosie's friend Marjorie had lost her husband at Anzio, but she still came to work the next day. "Can't stop," she had said, her voice trembling. He'd want the planes finished. That night, Rosie went home to her small apartment, switched on the radio, and listened to Churchill's voice rumble through the static. "We shall never surrender." She whispered the words along with him, her eyes on the photograph of her brother in uniform pinned to the wall. In France, Claire received a coded message through her contact in the market square. "A drop at midnight near Saint-Étienne," it said. "Supplies from London." She cycled 15 miles under moonlight, her heart pounding every time headlights appeared in the distance. In a clearing, a small plane swooped low, its engine barely audible. A crate parachuted down, thudding softly into the grass. She dragged it into the woods and hid it under branches. Inside were weapons, radios, maps, tools for liberation. 2 nights later, the Gestapo raided the café. Claire was questioned for hours, but smiled calmly, insisting she knew nothing of resistance activities. She was released, but one of her friends wasn't. That night, she cried silently, then picked up her bicycle again. There was still work to do. By 1943, the tide had begun to turn. Evelyn was transferred to a field hospital in Italy, where the front lines moved like shifting sand. The wounded came in waves: British, American, German, even Italian. She treated them all the same. A soldier was a soldier, no matter the uniform. One night, as artillery thundered in the distance, she found herself talking with a captured German boy, no older than 18. His arm was shattered, his eyes glassy with morphine. "Why are you helping me?" he asked weakly in halting English. She paused, holding his hand. "Because someone has to," she said. When he died the next morning, she closed his eyes gently and whispered a prayer she no longer truly believed in. Back in England, Joan's section cracked the most vital code of all, one that would reveal the location of German U-boats hunting Allied convoys. Her work now saved thousands, but she could never tell anyone. After the war, her records would be sealed. Her name wouldn't appear in history books. She would return to a normal life, marry, raise children, and carry the weight of her secret until the day she died. The world would never know what she had done, but that didn't matter to her. The satisfaction had always come from knowing she was part of something greater than herself. Rosie, too, saw the end of the war draw near. When the radio finally announced Germany's surrender, the factory erupted in cheers. Women hugged each other, tears streaming down faces streaked with grease. But behind the celebration was an emptiness. What now? Many would be asked to give up their jobs to returning men. Rosie looked at the unfinished bomber on the line and felt a pang of sadness. For years, this factory had been her battlefield, her purpose. She didn't know who she would be without it. Purpose. She didn't know who she would be without it. And in Paris, liberated at last, Claire walked among the cheering crowds as the Allies entered the city. The tricolor flags waved from every balcony. Bells rang. Strangers kissed in the streets. She smiled faintly, but couldn't forget the faces of those who hadn't lived to see this day. Her comrades, her friends. She carried their memory like invisible medals. When an American officer offered her a cigarette and asked her name, she simply said, "No one important." Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. The war ended, but for these women, peace didn't bring recognition. They returned to ordinary lives, their extraordinary deeds buried in silence. Evelyn became a midwife, Joan a teacher, Rosie a mother, Claire a ghost in the files of a forgotten network. Yet history was built on their shoulders. They were the unseen, the unheard, the quiet force that held the world together when it threatened to fall apart. The war was over, but the silence that followed was heavy. The sounds of sirens and gunfire faded, replaced by the hum of reconstruction, of nations trying to remember how to live again. But for many women, peace brought not celebration, but displacement. They had carried empires on their shoulders, fought battles without uniforms, and now, suddenly, the world told them to return to kitchens, to secretaries' desks, to silence. The banners that once said, "We can do it," came down. The uniforms went back in boxes. The women who had been the backbone of war were expected to become invisible once more. Evelyn Clark stepped off the hospital ship at Southampton in the summer of 1945, the sun bright against her tired eyes. The war in Europe was finished, but her thoughts still lived among the wounded she had treated. She had seen too much to simply forget. The look in dying men's eyes, the endless nights of screams, the feeling of holding a pulse fade beneath her fingertips. They had given her a medal for bravery, but it sat heavy in her hand. What was bravery, she thought, when it came at such a cost? She returned to her small flat in London, finding it half damaged from bomb blasts. A neighbor smiled kindly and told her how lucky she was to have survived. Evelyn smiled back but said nothing. Survival felt like a strange kind of guilt. A few weeks later, she found work at a civilian hospital. The wards were quieter, the beds cleaner, but something in her had changed forever. When young doctors barked orders or made light of pain, she felt anger rise inside her. They hadn't seen what she'd seen. Once, a fellow nurse asked why she never talked about her service years. Evelyn only shrugged. "People don't really want to hear it," she said softly. "They just want to believe it's over." But at night, she still woke to the sound of explosions that no longer existed, her heart racing as if she were still under the ground, still running through smoke. Far from London, in a modest brick house in Oxfordshire, Joan Harper adjusted her glasses and folded her newspaper neatly beside her teacup. She was now Mrs. Joan Kendall, wife of an accountant, mother of two. Her husband didn't know the full truth about her past, only that she'd done clerical work during the war. That's what she was told to say. The Official Secrets Act bound her for life, and she obeyed it. She smiled through polite conversations about those brave men at the front, and said nothing about the nights she had sat decoding enemy messages that had changed the course of the war. Sometimes, when her husband's colleagues talked about Dunkirk or D-Day, she had to bite her tongue to stop herself from saying, "I know things you can't even imagine." But she didn't. She just smiled and poured more tea. One evening, years later, her eldest son asked her, "Mum, what did you do during the war?" She hesitated for a long moment before replying, "Oh, nothing special. Just office work." He nodded, uninterested, and ran off to play. Joan sat quietly, staring at the rain on the window, feeling a small ache in her chest. She didn't need glory, but she wished, just once, that someone had known what she'd done, that her long nights of numbers and code and exhaustion had meant something to someone besides her. Across the Atlantic, Rosie Turner had traded her welding torch for an apron. The factory that had once roared like thunder was silent now, its doors locked, the women laid off to make room for returning soldiers. The same men who had saluted them in posters now looked at them as if they had trespassed. "You did your bit," her supervisor told her kindly, "but it's time for the boys to get back to work." Rosie nodded without protest, but as she walked home through the empty streets of Detroit, she felt the sting of it. She had been part of something bigger than herself, and now it was gone. The sound of machinery still echoed in her memory like a heartbeat. She married a man named Frank 2 years later, a mechanic who had served in Europe. He was kind, but he didn't understand why she sometimes stared at airplanes passing overhead with a strange longing. When she told him about her days at the plant, his smile was indulgent. "That was nice of you girls," he said once, "helping out while we were gone." She said nothing. He meant no harm, but she knew there had been nothing nice about it. It had been hard, dirty, dangerous work, and without it, there might not have been a victory at all. Still, she folded her memories away like blueprints in a drawer and tried to be content with the quiet life she was expected to live. In France, Claire Duval lived under another name now. After the liberation, she had been summoned to Paris by a British officer who thanked her for her service to the Allied cause and handed her a small envelope containing a medal and a note of appreciation. "You were very brave, Mademoiselle Duval," he had said. "France owes you much." Then he left, and she never heard from them again. The medal stayed in its envelope, hidden in a drawer. She returned to her café, rebuilt what the war had taken, and tried to forget. But the ghosts didn't leave. She still saw the faces of the men she'd betrayed to save others. She still felt the chill of the nights she spent waiting for parachute drops, wondering if she'd live until dawn. The world around her celebrated victory, but Claire carried her secrets like scars. In 1950, she received a letter from London, an invitation to attend a ceremony for former SOE agents. She almost went, but at the last moment, she tore the letter in half. What would she say to those who had fought in suits and medals when her war had been one of whispers and lies? She stayed home instead, standing behind her counter as tourists ordered coffee, unaware of who she was. The years passed. The world moved on. Television replaced radios. Children who had grown up in the war forgot the fear that had once defined their nights, and the women who had carried that fear, who had fought beneath it, faded into the background. But memory is a strange thing. It buries, it silences, yet sometimes it refuses to die. Evelyn grew older. By the 1960s, she was head nurse at a London hospital, her hair gray but her hands still steady. The young nurses admired her calmness, her precision. They didn't know it came from years of stitching wounds while bombs fell. One evening, a student asked her why she never seemed afraid of emergencies. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I've seen worse," she said simply. The student didn't understand, but Evelyn didn't explain. When she walked home through the city, she sometimes paused before the war memorial near Trafalgar Square, where names were carved deep into stone. There were no names of nurses there, only soldiers. She stood quietly, her eyes tracing the list, and whispered the names of those she remembered from underground wards long ago. In Oxfordshire, Joan's son grew up to become a historian. One day, while researching in the National Archives, he stumbled across a newly declassified file from Bletchley Park. As he read the description of women working in code-breaking units, his breath caught. "Mum," he said that evening over dinner, "did you ever work at a place called Bletchley Park?" Joan froze. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself a small smile. "Yes," she said softly. "I did." He stared at her in shock. "You never told us." She shrugged, sipping her tea. "We weren't allowed to." That night, she sat by the fire, the memories flooding back. Names, faces, laughter, exhaustion, triumph. For the first time, she felt seen. Rosie's story took longer to be remembered. In 1976, a journalist visited her hometown to interview surviving Rosie the Riveters. Rosie, now a grandmother with silver hair and grease still etched into her hands, told him everything. The long shifts, the danger, the pride. When the article was published, she was astonished to see her picture in the newspaper, smiling beside one of the bombers she had helped build. The headline read, "The Women Who Built Victory." For the first time, her grandchildren looked at her with awe instead of amusement. "You built planes, Grandma?" they asked. "Real ones?" She laughed, tears welling in her eyes. "Real ones," she said. And they flew. As for Claire, her recognition came too late for her to see it. She passed away quietly in 1983, her cafe inherited by her niece, who discovered a small wooden box in the attic. Inside was the torn invitation, a faded photograph of young resistance fighters, and the medal she had never worn. The niece took it to a museum in Lyon, where curators pieced together her story from wartime archives. When her name was finally placed on the Wall of Honor for French resistance members, it stood among hundreds of others, most unknown, many women. Visitors stopped to read her name, and though no one knew her face, her story began to whisper again through history. Decades after the war, their stories, Evelyn's, Joan's, Rosie's, and Claire's, were no longer forgotten. They appeared in books, documentaries, classrooms. Young women read about them and realized that history wasn't just about generals and battles, but about ordinary people who had done extraordinary things quietly. When the world had needed them most, they had answered without hesitation. And somewhere, perhaps, their spirits smiled, finally remembered not just as helpers, but as heroes. The war had changed them, but it had also bound them to moments that no passing of years could erase. Each woman carried within her a different battlefield, one of silence, memory, and endurance. The world around them was moving faster now. New wars, new machines, new generations that had never heard the air raid sirens wail or felt the ground shake beneath bombs. But sometimes, in quiet hours, their minds wandered back to the nights of danger and purpose that had defined who they once were. Evelyn Clark often walked by the river after her long shifts at the hospital. The Thames flowed quietly, reflecting the city lights, but to her it still whispered of the convoys that once slipped silently out to sea, carrying the wounded home. She remembered one particular night in 1943 when she had been stationed on a hospital ship crossing the Atlantic. A German U-boat had struck a nearby freighter, and they had spent hours hauling survivors from freezing water. She had held the hand of a sailor whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel, whispering to him over and over, "Stay with me." He had died before dawn. She never learned his name. Now, so many years later, she still dreamed of him sometimes, his eyes searching hers in the dark. In her dreams, he always smiled at the end, as if thanking her. That smile, she sometimes thought, had kept her alive more than any medal. At Bletchley Park, Years before the world knew its name, Joan Harper had lived through nights of quiet triumph and invisible panic. She remembered the strange rhythm of those days, the endless flow of intercepted messages, the hum of machines, the faint smell of damp paper and cigarette smoke. Once, she had cracked a small section of an encoded naval message that revealed the coordinates of a Japanese convoy heading toward an Allied fleet. Her superior officer had simply said, "Good work, Harper," and moved on. She had gone outside for air, standing in the cold, realizing that her pencil marks had likely saved hundreds of men's lives. There was no cheering, no medals, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing. Now, in the calm of her Oxfordshire home, when the house was silent, she sometimes took out her old notebooks and ran her fingers over the faded equations. Each number was a ghost of something enormous. Across the sea, Rosie Turner sat on her porch one evening in 1954, her hair wrapped in a scarf the same way it had been when she'd worked the assembly line. The air smelled of summer and motor oil. Frank was asleep inside, and the radio played softly. A baseball game, the commentator's voice low and steady. She thought of the factory, of the roar of machines and the heat of molten metal. She could almost feel the vibration through her boots. There had been danger every day, sparks flying, cranes groaning overhead. But she had loved it. The women had worked in rhythm, sweating and singing, calling out to one another through the noise. One day, a bomb casing had slipped from its harness, crushing a crate near where she stood. No one was hurt, but the shock had left her trembling. Her forewoman, May, had put a hand on her shoulder and said, "We don't have the luxury of being scared, honey. Not till they come home." Rosie smiled at the memory. May hadn't lived to see victory, killed in an explosion at the plant, but her words still lived inside her. In France, Claire Duval's memories came in flashes, shadows on a wall, the clatter of boots on cobblestones, the smell of fear and rain. In the spring of 1944, she had been tasked with guiding 2 British paratroopers through the woods near Dijon. They had landed off course and risked capture. For 3 nights, they had hidden in barns and hedgerows while German patrols swept the area. Claire had led them by moonlight, her revolver tucked beneath her coat. Once, they had come so close to discovery that she could hear the soldiers' voices in the dark, feel the brush of their rifles as they passed. One of the paratroopers had squeezed her hand, silently thanking her. She had guided them to safety, and then vanished back into the night. She never saw them again. After the war, she learned that both had survived and returned home. She sometimes wondered if they ever thought of her, the woman in the shadows who had led them through the dark. These moments, the flashes of courage, the fragments of fear, were never written in official histories. Yet they shaped the world as much as the great battles did. For every headline about victory, there were 1,000 unnamed acts of resolve. The women who had soldered, decoded, healed, and resisted did so not for glory, but for necessity. And yet, the cost of their strength was silence. In 1969, Evelyn received an invitation to speak at a nursing conference about her wartime service. She almost declined, but something inside her, perhaps the memory of those she'd lost, made her go. She stood before a room of young nurses, all in crisp uniforms, their faces bright with ambition. She told them about the underground hospitals, the shortage of supplies, the exhaustion that blurred into numbness. But she also told them about the humanity, the men who would joke even as they bled, the nurses who shared rations, the moments of laughter amid despair. When she finished, there was a long silence, and then a young woman stood and said softly, "Thank you for telling us what it was really like." For the first time, Evelyn felt something loosen inside her, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding for decades. Joan, too, found her recognition unexpectedly. In 1974, she was invited to Bletchley Park's first reunion of Codebreakers. She hesitated at the thought of returning, but curiosity won. The old estate had changed, now overgrown, its huts weathered by time. But as she stepped inside, memories rushed back. The familiar hum of the machines was gone, replaced by the soft chatter of old colleagues. Some she recognized instantly, others only by name tags. They spoke of nights spent chasing invisible patterns, of jokes whispered over ciphers, of the strange intimacy of shared secrecy. When the organizers read aloud a list of names of those who had died, Joan felt tears on her cheeks. For years, she had thought she'd been forgotten. Now she realized they had all been waiting, quietly, patiently, for the world to remember them. Rosie's life had settled into simplicity, but she carried her wartime pride like a flame that never went out. During the energy crisis of the 1970s, she took a job at a small workshop, fixing engines alongside men half her age. They were surprised by her skill, and one day a young mechanic asked, "Where'd you learn to work like that?" Rosie just smiled and said, "A long time ago, in a war that taught us more than we ever wanted to know." He looked puzzled, but she didn't explain. That night, she wiped her hands clean of oil, looked at the stars, and whispered a quiet thank you to May, to the women on the line, to the factory that had once been her world. Claire's story returned to light in an unexpected way. In 1980, a British historian researching the Special Operations Executive found her name in a file marked F section. He traced her to the small cafe still run by her niece. The niece told him Claire had died years earlier, leaving only fragments of her past. The historian pieced together her missions: sabotage, intelligence, rescue, and published her story in a book titled Women of the Resistance. When the book reached France, a small plaque was placed outside her cafe. Here lived Claire Duval, a courier of the French resistance. Her courage helped liberate this region. Locals brought flowers. For the first time, her name was spoken aloud with honor. By the end of their lives, each of these women had become symbols of something larger, though they never sought to be. Their stories reminded the world that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform or hold a weapon. Sometimes it sits at a desk with a pencil, or stands by a hospital bed, or waits in the dark for a signal that may never come. The world had long overlooked them, but their legacy had quietly endured. In every code cracked, every life saved, every machine built, every message carried through the shadows. In the autumn of her life, Evelyn visited France for the first time since the war. Standing on the cliffs near Normandy, she watched the waves crash below, the same sea that had carried so many to their fate. She thought of the men she'd treated, the women she'd worked beside, the world they'd helped rebuild. The wind caught her hair and she closed her eyes. Somewhere, she imagined, Joan was deciphering another secret, Rosie was turning another wrench, and Claire was still walking through the woods under the moon, her footsteps sure and steady, her footsteps sure and steady. History would remember their names now, but they had always been there, quiet, determined, and unbreakable. The forgotten women of World War II had never truly been forgotten. They had simply waited for the world to listen. Time moved forward, but memory lingered like the echo of a distant song. The women who had once stood at the heart of the world's greatest storm were now elderly, their hair silver, their steps slower, yet their spirits remained untouched by age. The war had taken much from them: friends, innocence, peace, but it had also given them something indestructible: purpose. Even as their faces faded from photographs and their names slipped through the cracks of history books, the quiet power of what they had done continued to ripple outward in unseen ways. Evelyn Clark sat by her window one winter morning, watching the snow fall across London. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a letter, handwritten, the kind few people sent anymore. It was from a young nurse named Alice, who had heard her speak at that conference years ago. The letter was filled with warmth and gratitude. "You made me understand," Alice had written, "that compassion is a kind of courage. When I walk into the ward each day, I think of you and the women who came before me." Evelyn smiled through tears. For the first time, she felt that her life's work, the nights of exhaustion, the losses she had endured, had come full circle. She was not forgotten. Her story had quietly passed into the heart of someone new. Joan Harper's final years were quiet ones. She kept her wartime notebooks neatly stacked on her desk, beside an old Enigma rotor she had been given as a souvenir during the Bletchley reunion. Sometimes she would open those pages, her fingers brushing over the faded ink, and she would smile. Not at the numbers, but at the memory of what they had meant. In her garden, she liked to sit among the lavender and listen to the wireless, the same sound that had once carried the world's chaos to her ears. When she passed away in 1985, her niece found a note tucked inside one of the cipher books. It read, "We never sought recognition. We sought victory and peace. If you are reading this, remember that the smallest effort, unseen and unpraised, can still change the course of the world." Her niece framed that note and donated the notebooks to a museum. Visitors stopped to read her words, unaware that the woman who wrote them had once saved thousands without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Rosie Turner lived to see her grandchildren grow up. They called her Grandma Rosie, and to them she was simply a warm, stubborn woman who always smelled faintly of oil and bread. One afternoon, her grandson came home from school and said, "Grandma, my teacher said women didn't fight in the war. Is that true?" Rosie laughed softly and wiped her hands on her apron. "We fought," she said, "just in different ways." She took him to the attic and opened a trunk filled with yellowed photographs, ration cards, and a small metal badge, the one she'd worn in the munitions plant. "We built planes, ships, bombs," she said, her eyes distant. "We worked till our hands bled. That was our battlefield." Her grandson stared at the photos in awe. "You were brave," he whispered. Rosie smiled, but her voice was gentle. "We all were, love. Every single one of us." When she died a few years later, the family placed that badge beside her photograph. To them, it was not just a keepsake. It was a medal. In a quiet village in France, the plaque honoring Claire Duval weathered decades of rain and sunlight. Tourists often stopped to read it, unaware of how much danger had once walked those very streets. One spring morning, a young woman named Leah stopped at the cafe and asked the owner, a gray-haired man, about the name on the plaque. He smiled. "Ah, Claire," he said softly. "My aunt. She carried messages for the resistance, saved lives, risked her own. She never spoke of it much." The young woman listened, eyes shining. She was a university student, studying history, and she decided that day to write her thesis on women of the French resistance. Months later, she would visit archives, uncover coded reports, and find Claire's name buried among hundreds. Her paper would win an award, and in her dedication she wrote, "For the women whose courage had no audience, may history finally hear them." The threads of their lives wove together in ways they could never have foreseen. A nurse's compassion inspired another. A codebreaker's note found its way into the heart of a museum. A factory worker's story lived on in the pride of her grandson. A courier's bravery sparked the curiosity of a new generation. The war had ended long ago, but its lessons, carried by women like them, had not faded. Their courage had not vanished. It had multiplied. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world had begun to rediscover them. Historians published books, documentaries aired on television, and, for the first time, the names of women appeared beside those of generals and soldiers. At memorials, wreaths were laid not only for the fallen, but for the unseen. In London, a statue of a nurse was erected beside the cenotaph, her hands reaching toward the wounded. At Bletchley, the huts were restored, filled with the soft hum of recorded Morse code. In factories turned museums, Rosie's generation was remembered as the women who built victory. And in France, visitors placed fresh flowers beneath Claire's plaque each year on Liberation Day. But the truest memorials were not made of stone or bronze. They were the quiet moments, the nurse comforting a patient through fear, the student discovering a forgotten file, the mechanic's daughter fixing an engine with steady hands. Their stories lived not in the past, but in the living echoes of every woman who carried strength without recognition. In her final days, Evelyn sat beneath the afternoon sun in her garden, surrounded by roses in bloom. The world was peaceful now, or at least as peaceful as it could ever be. She closed her eyes and listened. The distant laughter of children, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of life going on. She thought of the others, Joan, Rosie, Claire, and felt them close, as if time itself had folded and brought them all together once more. In her mind's eye, she saw them as they had been, young, fierce, and full of purpose, walking through fire with calm faces and steady hearts. She smiled. The world had finally remembered them, but even if it hadn't, it would not have mattered. They had never done it for remembrance. They had done it because it was right. Because when the world was at its darkest, they had lit the lamps and kept them burning. The wind stirred the flowers gently, as though carrying a whisper across time. A whisper from all those forgotten women who had refused to be broken. We were there. And though the years passed and generations changed, that whisper remained, soft but eternal, carried in every act of quiet courage, every moment of steadfast grace. The Forgotten Women of World War II had become part of history's heartbeat, reminding the world that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never ask to be seen. Never ask to be seen.